So if you don't have some kind of restraint on the people who are doing the most evil, then you will have chaos and you will have all sorts of anarchy, and it will be terribly, terribly destructive.
From a Christian standpoint or standard, why is policing important?
Yeah, because our culture is having a whole conversation now about getting rid of the police.
We just need to do away with the police. I said, no. Why is policing important?
Well, I guess the best way to test that question is to ask what would happen if there were no police. So if you had no restraint on the sinful desires of really sinful people, what would it look like? Well, it might look like what it looked like just before the flood, where every person was thinking only evil thoughts continually. And so if you don't have some kind of restraint on the people who are doing the most evil, people who are doing the worst things, then you will have chaos and you will have all sorts of anarchy, and it will be terribly, terribly destructive. The Lord put authorities and allows governments to exist. Indeed, he's the author of governments in order to protect the people. But important to that, and particularly when we talk about police reform, is to talk about whether you protect the people from the police as well. And Romans 13 talks about that. There are people who oversee those. So there's nobody without oversight. And that's probably the thing that I see from a Christian perspective, which is the most protective of all. So if you have no police, you have no protection. But when you have police, you've got to have protection from the police because they have a huge amount of power. So the power has to be guarded as well as exercised in order to protect the population from the evils that we know will go crazy and just completely out of control if we allow Satan to just completely operate the way he wants to.
Would you say that some of that guarding from the police are things like body cameras or reports or things like that? Or are there other mechanisms that you're referring to?
Well, that's part of the mechanism. It's very complicated. Probably the most protective feature of any package of protecting the people from the police is the culture of the police department and the culture of the politics that governs the police department. And that's where the biggest problem in police reform occurs. Because if you have an attempt to make police officers effective, doing that is extremely complicated. So you have training, but you also have cultivation. So you're not merely training officers to perform particular tasks. You have to cultivate them to think a particular way. And part of that is to be treated in a way that's respectful. But it goes both ways. So if you want to see a good example of how police don't do it well, go back to the 60s and the 70s. And you look in the 1960s and 70s, and policing was all about restraint and clamping down on people. So there was no real idea of any kind of community policing where the police work with the community to solve problems. It was about actually constraining people to particular areas. And when Parker was in power in the city of Los Angeles, for example, he said, well, some people should be in the South Los Angeles, and we need to help them stay there and keep them there. And people in the North End or the center of Los Angeles, the different Hispanic groups and white groups, etc. Well, if you're using the police to enforce that kind of segregation, what do you expect is going to happen? Bad things are going to happen. But when you have that kind of belief coming from a chief of police, and the culture at the time accepted that, you end up treating the police differently. You're expecting them to do things like have quotas on arrests. That's not a good idea. If your whole idea of success is how many people you can throw in jail, then you've missed the point of why you have a police department. The police department is to work with the police. The police department is to work with the people to reduce the effects of criminals. And sometimes you do it without putting criminals in jail. Sometimes you do it by hardening the targets. But more importantly, you can't work with a public if the public just sees you as harsh and detached. And the police agencies at the time were harsh and detached from their officers. So this is a rather difficult metaphor to use, but it's as if when you beat the dog, what do you expect the dog to do? You know, the dog's going to bite. And so you had a lot of that going on in the 60s and 70s. Police departments did not treat their officers well. And as a matter of fact, when you go into the 1970s, the police departments were very aggressive in trying to root out officers that they didn't like. They called them headhunters, you know, the internal affairs people. And it was so bad that even the ACLU recognized that officers needed to have some rights.
Wow.
And so you had what was then a momentous act of police reform, which was to restrain not the police against the people, but the management against the officers, which was the first time in the history of the United States, and this was in California, where you had a peace officer bill of rights, which protected officers from all sorts of things that go on in investigations. We could get into it if we wanted to, but the bottom line is if you mistreat the officers enough, they will not behave properly. They'll do things to evade capture and detection, and you don't want that. So one of the problems that we had for decades started to slow down when you had that reform where you're saying, okay, let's treat the officers like human beings to start with, and then we'll teach the officers to treat everybody else that way as well. That actually did work, that it started to change the way that the officers behaved, the way they viewed people. You also had a lot of training that went on inside the police departments to moderate their ideas of what their role was. So it went from being policing as a restraining system to policing as a cooperative venture with the public.